Welcome to WCAT. I'm Kiki Latimer, and I'm your host for the Catholic Bookworm, where we read to learn, but we share with love in order to understand and hopefully be transformed in our lives. And very happy to have with me today Laura Vosika. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you very much. It's
Laura,
nice to be here.
I've read here the first of the chronicles of it's the Bluebells of Scotland and so the Bluebells Chronicles.
Right.
And how many books are there?
There are 5, and I happen to have, so the 5th is right here, and this was meant to be a trilogy, but what happened, in fact, it was meant to be a standalone, but my sister read the end and she said, what happens next? And I thought, well, that's a funny question because I thought he was dead. And so I went back and I reread the ending and I realized I never said he was dead. It was implied, but I didn't say it. And I thought, well, what if by a miracle he actually survived this terrible injury? And I won't give away what happened to him, but I will say I've now been trampled by a horse and a ram. So you can survive some pretty awful injuries. I also narrowly avoided being run over by our UTV on our farm on some steep hills. And that would have been, I wouldn't be here, but miraculously it missed me. I ended up on my back next to it. So miracles do happen. And I thought, it was a bad injury, but he survived. So I wrote the second part where he is in medieval Scotland with his lookalike, and they have to pretend to be the same person. And he goes through a lot of changes living in medieval Scotland. And then the third part is what happens when you return to your own time, completely changed because of 2 years living in a completely foreign culture. But each of the second and third parts became too long. So books 2 and 3 are the middle of the trilogy. Books 4 and 5 are the third part of the trilogy, which is 5 books. So I'm not very good at math, I guess.
Well, wonderful, wonderful characters. Why don't we start off with a prayer? How's that sound? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord Jesus, we ask you to guide our conversation today, develop our thoughts and what we say for our listeners, and help us to enjoy a friendship during this time together. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So, Laura, tell us a little bit about yourself for our listeners today who don't know you.
Well, I like to say first that I'm a mother. I have 9 children plus my stepdaughters. So between us, my husband and I have 7 boys and 3 daughters, and they are all grown now, although they were all at home when I started writing this series, and that was interesting. I was originally a musician. And I guess I don't have a cover with the trombone, but I do have a little rubber duck with the trombone. And that's because I just got a Jeep yesterday, and this is a Jeep thing that you trade ducks with other Jeep owners. So of course mine had to have a trombone. And so I was originally a musician. I majored in music at Lawrence University on trombone, and I loved it. I also played other instruments. So when you're reading about the musicians in the book, I do play harp like Neil does. I'm nowhere near as good as he is, but I know what I'm talking about at least. I majored on trombone. I played in jazz bands. I played in symphonies. I played in pit orchestras for ballets and musicals. So that was a lot of fun. I played for 3 years in a jazz band out in Washington State. So we got to play and had groupies and had people swing dancing to our music. So when I'm talking about Shawn, this is all based on personal knowledge. And in fact, the title of the first book, Bluebells of Scotland, it is because that's a piece that trombonists love to play to prove that they're really good. And I'm sorry to say I never mastered it, but got sidetracked by some other things. But so that's kind of been my life. I played a lot of music. I've raised a lot of kids, and I run the Books and Brews podcast where we talk to authors and pair, well, now my husband pairs cocktails, but it started off pairing beers as you would pair wine to meals. And so it's a fun concept. And so far, I have had every author say they've had a blast doing it. And then because we're not busy enough with that, we also live on Glenmerrill Farms, which is named after the castle in the series. And that means Glen of Miracles. And ironically, both of our Glenmerrills up in northern Minnesota and now down here in the Appalachians are on mountaintops, not in glens at all. But we like our Glen of Miracles, even if it is on a mountaintop. And that's a little bit about who I am.
So how did you make the transition from music to words and writing? And
well, I really didn't. From the time I was quite young, almost from the time I had these concepts, I wanted to be a musician and I wanted to be a writer. And so my trombone professor at Lawrence always told me, you have to focus on one thing. I'm not very good at focusing on one thing, so I do many things. And so I've kind of been doing music and writing all along. And I did take a little bit of a break for a while when my kids were really young. But about the time my oldest was probably 14, 15, I started writing again. And I was teaching music lessons the whole time too. So they've kind of worked in parallel.
awesome. So you were writing with 9 children at home?
Yes.
You're
Yes.
a big soul.
Well, it was, I have always told people they think that having 9 kids is hard. And I say it's actually much harder to have 3 or 4. And the reason is when you have 3 or 4, usually they're going to be fairly close together. You're the only parent, assuming you're at home and your spouse is at work. So it's 1 against 3 or 1 against 4. But by the time you have 9, number one, some of them are older. They don't need as much hands-on. They're my kids all started doing their laundry on their own.
Right.
Didn't even tell them to, they just decided to. But,
Right.
As they get older, they pitch in, they start taking care of themselves more. They're at school, they're at activities, they're at friends' houses. And when you have 4 or 5 still young, they're playing with each other. And so it's not that intense that mom has to do everything for us and entertain us and read to us. So when I was writing, as an example, I would sit by our back deck door and they would be out in the backyard. It was fully fenced. They had their Tonka trucks. They had their big dirt pile. They were out there running their little army trucks and Tonka trucks all over their dirt pile. They were involved in their games. And I think too, with 9 kids, you get to be very flexible. And so
You're better, right?
right. And you get, I think, good at focusing on what you need to and knowing when you have to pay attention and when you can let that be background noise. But I kind of joke that, I had 7 boys. They loved their Nerf guns. And so there were days they were literally having Nerf gun battles around me. And it's just like I'm heads down writing and thinking, well, I am writing about battles. So they're helping me get in the mood of there's a battle going on around me. I can do this.
You learn the difference between the scream and the real scream, right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
I have 4. My son and his wife have 6, and we do see that the older ones are now parenting the little ones, and everybody you change roles and it evolves.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think too, a lot of people do worry, oh my gosh, you're making the older kids be the parents. And I don't think that that's really what's going on. They pitch in and they help because they're learning life skills for when they're adults. But with me, with my kids, they loved having little siblings. I mean, to the point where when I got divorced, they still kept saying, when are we having another baby? I'm like, kids, think about what you're asking me. Unless I get married again really soon, but they loved having siblings. And even my youngest, he wanted younger siblings too. And so they were absolutely thrilled when their brother started having kids of his own. And so now I have 4 grandchildren. I can't give it away, but I'm going to anyway. I have two granddaughters from two separate kids, and so I just got them because we live on a farm, matching pink Carhartt overalls. And I can't wait to see them in those. So, but yeah, they loved having younger siblings.
Fun, fun. So your main character here is Shawn, and and one of the things you mentioned is that a lot of times when people start the book, they don't like Shawn at all.
Not at all.
Shawn, and we should mention your book goes between present day,
yes,
to medieval Scotland of the early 1300s, and you have a character that moves in time.
Right, two of them, in fact.
Yeah, and so I do want to mention, and I did the same thing when I started this. I was like, oh, this reminds me of Outlander, of which I read four of the 5 books quite some time ago. And so I was fascinated when you wrote to me and said you hadn't even heard of Outlander,
right,
when you were writing, which is, great minds think alike, I guess.
Well, I had never heard of her. I only heard of her to begin with because people started asking me, did you copy her? And of course, to a writer, that's just, no. Right.
And Diana Gabaldon, I mean, we have to say, is an amazing writer.
Well, and I believe I have to thank her for an awful lot of my sales. I believe that my books altogether have probably sold, I want to say, around 120,000 copies. So they were selling extremely well. And she was a big reason because I just had the dumb luck of writing it at the same time that her books were huge. So people on her forums were talking about my book and saying, if you like this kind of thing, pick these up. So she gave me a huge boost. And in fact, I was at an author's book fair with her. And so I have a picture of her pretending to read the 3rd book. So I love that picture. Yeah. But I was actually probably more inspired by Margaret J. Anderson, who lives out in Oregon. She's from Scotland. And back in the 70s, she wrote a book called In the Keep of Time. And it is about 4 siblings who go into Smailholm Keep in Scotland, and they come out in a different century. Now, Margaret's books, I believe they come out in the 1500s. Diana's, I think it's like the 1740s. It's during the Jacobite Revolution. And mine, they end up in 1314. And that's because the song Bluebells of Scotland, to back up a little bit, that the main character Shawn plays all the time, it's kind of his signature piece. It talks about noble deeds and streaming banners. And so that's the kind of book I want to read. So obviously that's the kind of book I'm going to write. And so when I did the research, I found that their greatest victory was Bannockburn in 1314. And so that's kind of how that came to be.
So going back in, so a lot of people don't like Shawn at first.
And no, they don't.
But Shawn is kind of just your modern playboy.
I think he is.
A guy.
Right. And now that's what surprises me, because he is a womanizer. He is a heavy drinker. He is a partier. He is not a nice guy, but he's also funny and he's fun loving. And he's a very successful businessman. So he's only 24. And he's not only this amazing musician, but he's carried this orchestra, this little Midwest orchestra, to great heights. And he's done things like issued trading cards of the musicians, and they're getting royalties from all these albums and these celebrities he's bringing in. So he's got good qualities. And I don't understand why people are so horrified with him, because I look back at college, and I don't want to smear anyone. I'm not going to name names, but I think a lot of the guys there were just like him. They went to their frat parties to see who they could, go to bed with. And I knew guys who were cheating on their girlfriends, and they didn't think twice about it. And this was just the way they lived. And, that's not, it's an indictment on society. And yet I don't understand why society we all know this happens, and yet they're horrified by Shawn. So I don't know if I just made it too clear. It's not graphic. And that is one thing a lot of people like about my books, is that they're not, we know what he's doing, but they're not overtly graphically sexual. So,
well, I think a lot of times when people are confronted with the reflection of what they've sort of taken for granted as okay or no big deal, but when you see it clearly spelled out in a character book, maybe you can just see it easier in someone else. I had a really funny thing happen many years ago now in an ethics class at the University of Rhode Island. I was sort of co-teaching with Dr. Stephen Schwartz, and I guess I had been to India, or somehow we were talking about arranged marriages in India. And, and they're arranged today. These young people get to meet each other. They get to meet a number of people before they select who they're going to have an arranged marriage with. But the class was horrified by the idea of arranged marriage. And what sort of came out in this class discussion with about 30 young people, what they were really horrified about was the idea of having sex with a stranger on your wedding night. And so there was this murmuring of like, oh God, can you imagine getting married and just meeting somebody and then having to go to bed with them? And then I looked at them all and I said, well, isn't that what you guys do all the time? Like, you meet people at a bar, you meet people in your dorm, and you jump into bed with them, and they all were like,
that's different.
And you could see, though, this light going on in the room. It was really fascinating. They had never, I said, you guys get married to strangers all the time.
Yes. Yeah.
And it was really, really fascinating that it was really they thought that they were unnerved by the idea of having sex with somebody. It was really the idea of marrying someone that you didn't know that well. And then I explained that these young people in the arranged marriages do get to know one another. But their initial reaction was the sexuality. When confronted directly with, well, I bet most of you in this room have done that, gone to a stranger, you could see that they looked differently suddenly on their own behavior. There was enlightening. I saw it happen. And if they hadn't done it, they knew friends who had done it.
Like I said,
who had done it. And so I think there is something about seeing something, your own behavior blatantly spelled out.
Right. Well, and Shawn's, he takes his girlfriend for granted. He is cheating on her. He cons her out of her grandmother's ring that she was given because he gambled away his trombone the night before the last concert, and tells her, I need to pawn this ring to get the trombone back, but I promise I'll get your ring back. And so he is awful in many ways, but he also, part of the reason she sticks with him for 2 years is that she first didn't like him, but then when he took a shine to her and she saw him when he wasn't playing to an audience, she saw he's different. When he's not putting on a show, he's a very different person. And as you go through the book, you find out that he was raised by very good parents who really taught him right. But there was a tragedy that the book gets into later in the series. And he decided, I'm not going to be like my dad. I'm not going to be a good guy who's always taking care of other people. I'm going to look out for myself. Life is about having fun, and I'm not going to end up like my dad did because of this tragedy. And so as he goes through medieval Scotland, he's kind of, I think, coming back to his roots. And he's also in a place where until the 1500s, everybody was Catholic. I guess there was Catholic and Orthodox at that point, but he goes into a very Catholic, a very Christian world where he is surrounded by very different values, where what you do means life and death. And he finds out that in modern America, if you are taking advantage of man's daughter and he comes at you with a pitchfork, he's probably going to be the one to end up in jail, not you. In medieval Scotland, the guy can come at you with a pitchfork and you better beg for your life. the fathers had the ability to say, you are not going to do wrong to my daughter. So he goes through all this process. And part of the reason he had to be so awful to begin with is because it really is a redemption story. And if he was a nice guy, what are you being redeemed from? There's not much of a story there.
You really do develop and work on developing his virtue as the story goes on. Like you're saying, he has to shape up, certainly
right.
in medieval Scotland.
Well, and I would say even in medieval Scotland, you always have a choice. Maybe his choice was mainly self-preservation to begin with, but the longer he lived there, the more he got to know people, the more he actually started to care and to realize, yes, I'm stuck in this situation. He could have still chosen to be obnoxious. He might have gotten thrown off a castle tower or run through, but he was arrogant enough, I think, to think that probably wasn't going to happen to him. So it is always still a choice, but our surroundings help us choose one way or the other. So he did make the right choice, at least.
So now your other character, Amy, your readers haven't always liked Amy either to begin with because of,
right.
I mean, she's putting up with this jerk.
Right, she is. And that's another thing that surprised me a little bit was they see her as weak, and to an extent that's true. I see it, however, as a weakness that really in a way is born of strength, because she sees who he is when he's not putting on a show. She sees that there is something better in him, and there is. You know, we find that out through the series, that he has this strong background of good values and good faith, and he does come back to it. And all along, she's been seeing that in him. She knows, for instance, that he's sponsoring children through, let's say, Unbound. So I'll put out an ad for them. He's sponsoring, I don't even know how many. Maybe you read the book and found out. I forgot. It's been a long time. But he's doing all this charity work behind the scenes because he's made himself a lot of money with what he's done for this orchestra. And he's giving to all these charities, and he never tells anyone that. And so she has put up with his shenanigans because she also sees the good side, and she keeps hoping, that good side is going to come out as he matures and grows up a little bit. And we open the book with, yes, her being conned and giving in to him yet again. But on the other hand, within a few chapters, she also finally says, enough. I've put up with this garbage. I kept thinking there was something better. I'm finally starting to think there's not. And she walks away and leaves him in the castle tower. And in fact, she takes their rental car that they have in Scotland and she drives off and goes back to the hotel. And he's stuck there in the tower. So it does start with an act of strength. But one thing, I sent you the article that I put up about her on my blog. And part of what's happening is also, I think, very common today. It doesn't have to be a woman particularly. It's anybody who gets involved with somebody who's a little bit narcissistic, that they do start with seeing the good side and thinking you're so wonderful that when the first little thing happens, you think, I must have misunderstood that. Then another thing happens, maybe a few weeks or a few months later, and it's a gradual thing. And all of a sudden you find out, I'm not the person I used to be. When did this happen? Because the self-doubt has grown, and you've been told so often, no, that conversation didn't happen, the gaslighting. And I think we're living again in a world where people have strayed so far from common values and common faith. I think a lot more people today are getting involved with that sort of person. And they do get broken down slowly, and hopefully they find the strength to get out, which Amy does. So I would like to see her as, again, a very common tale today. And
I've heard the statistic, and I don't know if it's true, but I've heard, and even if it's half true, that the average abused woman goes back to the relationship 17 times.
Oh my goodness.
She finally leaves. And I think one of the things that is brought out in your book and that we know is that sexuality, having sex with someone, making love with someone, creates bonds.
It does. And that makes it hard to leave.
Women, but we can pretend that that doesn't happen, but the whole sexual revolution of casual sex and no bonds, it just doesn't really exist, because the human heart is just so much more complex than that.
And this is one thing that I really saw in college, and I've often said, thank goodness I played trombone, because I saw the guys there in a way that all the other women at college didn't, because, it was me and all these guys. And sometimes they'd kind of forget that I'm not one of the guys, and they would talk very freely. And I learned very quickly, all the girls in college, they're like, oh, I'm at a frat party and all these guys are attracted to me and I must be so wonderful. I listened to these trombone players talk. And again, they were nice guys, but they were a product of our culture. They're sitting around talking about how easy these girls are. They're sitting around talking about, oh yeah, if you want to, I don't want to be crude, but if you want to get laid tonight, this is the one to look for at the frat party. And I saw very clearly, in high school, I think I believe the same. If somebody wants to sleep with you, it's because they're in love with you. And I saw very clearly, oh, no, that's not. That is not what's going on. For the girls, it is. But for the guys, it's not. And that that helped keep me on the straight and narrow. I was like, I am not going to be one of the ones that these guys are talking about.
I mean, that old adage, what is it? Women give sex to get love and men give love to get sex,
Uh-huh.
It's, Mars and Venus out there.
Yes. Yeah. And I wish that more young women and girls in high school, I wish they would really realize that. As I said, I saw it close up. The average guy is not going to tell the average girl that. But when you're playing trombone with them and they're just talking, they forget that you're not one of them. They're giving away their secrets.
It's fascinating. You bring up some of the, the sexual revolution told us, the free sex world, Woodstock, do whatever you want without consequences, contraception, abortion, these sort of easy choices that we're going to bring in a brave new world. And you kind of tackle some of these issues in your book, the consequences that come, especially for women, for men as well, but especially for women.
Right.
That these choices outside of marriage can lead terrible consequences, painful consequences.
Yes. Yeah, and we're really seeing it. What is it? Do you happen to know the statistic about how many children are now born into single parent homes?
It's huge. Yeah.
It's huge. And one of the things that we saw, my kids were mainly raised in a suburb of Minneapolis, and it was a very diverse neighborhood. And one of the young men that was friends with one of my sons, he came, had dinner with us after graduation. He showed up with his bow tie and his, he was looking very dapper. And he was telling us that he had a father in the home. We lived in a place where an awful lot of kids didn't have a father in the home, but here he is, 18, looking sharp as a tack. And my dad said, you dress for success. And I'm like, that's what we need. You need two parents. You need a father in the home. You need that.
I mean, we see men like, Jordan Peterson trying to reach out to young men because they have grown up. Charlie Kirk. I mean, we see men reaching out to young men, particularly young men, because they have grown up in fatherless homes.
Well, and I think
generation also, I want to mention, it's just coming out, 1/3 of that generation young people in their 30s, 40, it'd be like 20 to 40. I get the Gen Z and all of that. I get them all mixed up. But one
I
third
do
of
too.
that generation was aborted.
That's a terrifying
And
number.
at least one third of that generation was brought up without a father in the home. And the statistics are just unbelievable.
Well, and my book actually does touch on that. Now, my oldest son was born when I was 20. He was a surprise. Let's just say we joke that he was born 7.5 months early after I got married. So I did get a little, well, I did get a little off my values once, and that's all it takes. And we did get married. We raised 9 children. And what was I going to say about this? I totally forgot what I was going to say about this. What had you said?
I was saying that one third of these children were brought up without a father in the home.
Right. Okay. So because of that, because most of my friends in college were very liberal, I was very strongly pro-life. They knew it. And I've always thought if I had not been, if they hadn't known, they would have pressured me into abortion.
Oh, okay.
So I launched into a very, very deep dive on the subject and read every book that I could possibly find on the subject from both sides. I mean, I had my convictions, but you know what? I'm going to read both sides. I talked to people on both sides. I actually had a friend whose baby was born as a result of a very violent rape at knife point in an alley when she was 15. That was in the 50s, so she ended up being shunned by all her friends and their parents. But you know what? She gave birth to that baby. She loved that child. She eventually was forced to give it up for adoption. I won't go into that whole long story. But the point of all of this is in doing this deep study, one of the things I learned, I had always thought, well, I'm against abortion because it takes the life of a baby. But I thought, well, I just bought the lie that it makes the women happy. I found out it doesn't. And I found out how often abortion is really good for men. Because let's say you're committing incest, you can hide the crime. Let's say, you don't want to pay 18 years of child support, you pressure your girlfriend into abortion. There are so many reasons the men are pressuring the women. Obviously some women want the abortion, but a lot of them don't. And in fact, at the time, I was giving talks with my friend Kay Zabolski, who had the baby as a result of rape, and my friend Shelley, who was pressured into an abortion when she was 16. And she did not want that abortion, but her father just begged and pleaded and wouldn't let up until she agreed. And that's exactly what kind of leads to Amy finally saying enough with Shawn, is he had pressured her into an abortion that she didn't want. And he was relentless and wouldn't let up. And again, I think most people don't really know this unless it's happened to them personally. And they don't know how many women regret the abortion, even if they thought it was a good idea at the time. They do end up, not all of them, but many of them do end up regretting it. They do end up drinking or doing drugs because they've got that pain inside that just won't go away.
I worked with a crisis pregnancy center for over 20 years, and I have a 10-hour seminar on YouTube, a free seminar called Understanding Abortion. And one of the things I mentioned during that seminar that we heard over and over again, it was the woman who would say, I have to have an abortion in these circumstances, because if I gave birth to this baby, I would love it too much to ever give it up for adoption. And we just heard those words over and over again. I have to have an abortion because fill in the blank. Somebody's not supporting me. My parents don't support me, my boyfriend, my husband, my brother, my sister, somebody's against this pregnancy. And so I have to have an abortion. But if I gave birth to this baby, I would love it way too much to ever give it up for adoption.
Well, and what I used to hear was, I have to because I have no choice. And I always thought, well, that kind of defeats the purpose of saying you have a choice.
Right.
Because so many, they feel that they don't have a choice. Right. It's true. Yeah.
The crisis pregnancy agencies are so important for giving people a choice.
Well, and in fact, when I first found out I was pregnant, my ex-husband is from Ireland. And I had a lot of stuff happened in my family of origin. I had been threatened with being kicked out of the home. I finally left. So I was on my own, didn't have parents to turn to. He told me he was going back to his girlfriend in Ireland, what had been his ex-girlfriend. He said, I'm getting back together with her. So in my situation, I really was completely alone. I did not have family. I didn't think I had him. But you know what? I had my convictions. And so to me, I'm someone who doesn't say, can I do it? I say, this is what needs to be done. Now we're going to figure out how to do it. And, I'm incredibly grateful. I mean, I have this wonderful son and, I love him dearly. And then we have all these other kids too. And they love having each other. And I would hope that that's a story for other people to say, I can do it. What's the right thing.
I saw a movie once, and I can't think of the name of it at the moment, but there was a beautiful line in it where a woman was in that kind of a situation. And she had a friend who was the doorman in her apartment building who kind of figured out that he was pretty sure she was pregnant. And at one point, she says, I don't know what to do. And, I don't have family. I don't have support. The boyfriend has left. I'm all alone. And the doorman turns and he looks at her and he smiles and he says, but you're not alone anymore, are you? You've got another little person in there. You're not alone anymore. And so, that awareness of realizing that, and you bring that out in your book, that these choices matter. They really matter, and they have long-term consequences.
Yeah. And so one of these is Amy is pregnant again. And that's why she says, you are not going to push me into this a second time. I regret that you pushed me into it the first time. Never again. And her son, James, will be born later in the series. It became a joke in my writers group because it takes time to write these books. They're like, hasn't Amy been pregnant for about 3 years now? Like, yeah, well, we're getting to that point. But James actually becomes a very central figure later. And I think that part of the story there is we have a purpose. God didn't just make us willy-nilly like, oh, I'll do this and I'll do that. I absolutely believe that we are born with a purpose that he wants us to fulfill. And I mean, in my life, that's writing and music. I've known that almost from the time I could formulate thoughts. I knew what I wanted. I knew what I was here to do. And everybody has that. And when they're gone, well, we're losing these people who had a purpose and a meaning in life.
I remember, it reminds me of Mother Teresa being asked, why hasn't God sent someone to cure AIDS back in the day, and she said, oh, he did, but you aborted him. And it's like, whoa, we all have a purpose. It's so important to realize that. You did a huge amount of research for this book.
Yes.
Talk about that a little.
Yes.
We don't want to give away too much. You've got a beautiful story here, but tell us about what kind of research you had to do for this.
This would be part of my research. We have quite a cache of medieval weapons in our home. And this actually is my husband's. Right. But part of the reason I bought myself a sword even before he and I got married was I wanted to know, what is it to spend hours a day holding something this heavy, fighting with it? What is it to swing it around? That's why I had an Irish wolfhound, because throughout the book you hear about the Laird's great hunting hounds, and they probably were pretty much what an Irish wolfhound. I'll try not to get sidetracked. The Irish wolfhound was recreated starting, I think, around the 1850s because they had almost died out. So the breed had to be rebuilt. And so it's probably not exactly what they had then, but very similar. I wanted to know, what is it to live with a dog this size? And mine was little. She was only 110 pounds. And I would say that the females average 120 to 140. We have known a male Irish Wolfhound 210 pounds.
That's a
And
horse. It's not
yes,
a
it is. And in fact, I have a fantastic picture of my grandson, my oldest one, when he was very little. We put the little, I have a helmet, I have a medieval helmet, and we set him on top. We were holding him, so he wasn't really putting his weight, but we held the sword by his hand. We held the helmet by him and set him on top of Leodin, our dog. It's a cute picture. I did a lot of reading online. I did a lot of going to forums, and I went to Scotland 5 times. And what I would do is write the book. My books, I don't really plan very well, which makes editing a nightmare. But it also, I think, is part of why the people seem very natural, because I'll be writing and they'll say or do something that I didn't intend them to do. And so I write the book first. Whatever happens, happens. And then I would go to Scotland and visit as many of the locations as I could. So, for instance, when you're reading about, I think it's called Eden, I keep wanting to say Eden Prairie because that's a Minneapolis suburb, but Eden Court Theater, I think, is the name. I went there and I was really scared at the time. Like, I don't have a published book. Am I, passing myself off as something I'm not? But I went in and I said, I'm writing this book and there is a concert going on in Eden Court Theater in this book. Would you be willing to show me the whole place? Show me the green room, show me the back areas where nobody else gets to go. And so her name was Judith, and she was so nice. And she was so excited about this. And she said, I can, but not today because Prince Andrew is having a tour. So we had to go back. Yeah, so I missed Prince Andrew by that much. So we had to go back the next day, but she took us. So when you read about the green rooms and when you read about the green exit signs with the green man running, it's all what's there, at least what was there at the time. I don't know if it still is. I went to, they're not entirely sure where the actual battle took place. One thing I learned, this is very interesting. When you're reading about history, especially the farther back you go, what the landscape was like then is not necessarily the same landscape we're seeing today. And that's part of why, even though it's described very well as kind of being in this confluence of rivers, it's hard to know how much the rivers and the landscape have shifted. So we went to what they think was a little part of the actual battle, and we walked around the whole town looking at places, comparing to all the research I had done. I learned about midges there, and you don't know about midges. You don't know to research midges, and they're like smaller than gnats.
And, things, right?
Yes, yeah, they're like gnats, but smaller. And so one thing I learned things like 60 degrees in Duluth is a warm day. 60 degrees in Scotland is a whole different story. It was about 60, 65 most of the time I was there on my first trip, and I was bundled in 7 layers because there's always this cold wind and it's blowing in the water off the water. And I was told you want the wind because when the wind stops, then you get the midges. And they're, to give you an example of
they
midges.
Bite, right? They bite.
I think they do. And in fact, I think I got a few bites. But to give you an idea of midges, my first husband and I, on our first trip, we spent the night it was a train car that had been turned into a hostel. We woke up in the morning and I thought, this is very odd. What's all this sand in the windows? In, what do you call that? The runner in the window where the track, and all this sand in the corners of the table. I looked closer and realized that's piles and piles of tens of thousands of dead midges. That's not sand. And I kid you not, I think we spent half an hour vacuuming up all the midges. And there were midges in the water I'd left out overnight. So it's a very interesting thing. And this is one of the reasons I think why people in Scotland actually like my books. And I've been told we don't like Americans who write about Scotland because they don't get it right. Because I went there and because I did all the research, I got most of it right, at least. I did make one mistake, in fact, two, but I'm not going to admit to what those are. I'll let people figure that out for themselves. Actually, I will tell you one. I assumed, because this is a Catholic program, I assumed that the Mass was almost completely unchanged since very early times. I found out that there is one change, and I didn't think to research this. They didn't always have the first two readings. And so there is a part where, what is it? The second reading is always from the New Testament, right? And so Hugh, he's the Laird's brother, he says to Shawn, okay, so if you were really paying attention at Mass, what was the second reading from? Was it from, Ruth or whatever other Old Testament book? And Shawn throws up, it was from Ruth. And of course, Hugh gets a big kick that he caught him in a lie. He's like, nope, because the second reading is always from the New Testament. So, you're lying. And I found out later that they actually, I think they only had one reading and then the gospel. So I did get that wrong, but now I know. Yeah, so there are a couple details I didn't get right, but very few.
Probably changed with Vatican II, I'm guessing, but maybe earlier.
Well, I'm sure it's, I don't know when that change happened. I actually started researching the history of the Mass, and it is very, very similar to even the very earliest days. And yes, the Latin Mass is very different. We go to that occasionally. Our nearest one is an hour and a half away, so it's a bit of a trek.
Amazing. Well, it's a wonderful book, and you've got 5 books, you said, in the series, right?
I have 5 books in the series. I couldn't find a copy of it. We have a book that my husband and I wrote called The Saint in the Cellar. And so I don't know if you're familiar with the anchorites of medieval times.
No.
That's a very interesting story. This was really popular about 1100s up to maybe the early 1300s. And I happened to know about them because of the research I was doing. The anchorites wanted to devote their lives to God. And so this sounds horrible until you know a little more of the details. They would have themselves literally sealed into a cell that they could never leave. It's not quite as bad as it sounds because they had a window into the church so they could attend Mass, and they had a window to the outside street so that they could spend their day in prayer, except then they would counsel people who came to them for spiritual advice. And they would have a servant who would put the food, I guess they had a way of getting the food in there, obviously, but they would spend their entire lives in there. And so the Saint in the Cellar is based on that.
They had a chamber pot in there that they
they would have.
That's my big concern. Where am I going to go to the bathroom?
I know. We need to think about these things. So the servant would take out the chamber pot and bring in the food, hopefully at 2 different times. And so my now husband and I were looking at a house in St. Paul that was built by a lumber baron of the late 1800s. Yes, want to get my century right. And when we went down into the basement, in this basement, it was a mansion, so the basement was absolutely gorgeous. It wasn't a cellar at all. But there was this room that I think it might have been used as some kind of, I don't know what it was, but it had a door. It was about the size of what these cells might have been. And it had this grill looking into what would have been the laundry room years ago, but was now this beautiful white room that they had all these plants in. And so because I had just been reading about anchorites, we looked at this and went, oh my gosh, there's an anchorite cell. There's a saint in the cellar. And we went, that is such a good title. We need to write a book to go with it. So we did. And it's a story. It's kind of a little bit fantastical, but it is about some of these modern issues about this kind of power couple. They get this new job in St. Paul and they move into this house and they've got this little boy, and the mother is trying to make him, set for success in the world. So she's got him learning French and taking dancing lessons and learning to eat oysters or steak tartare or whatever. And he's just a kid. And so he's living in this fantasy world. And you see that from the very start, where he's this knight in this alternate reality. And he's fighting with Methred against the Red Dragon. And he meets this Catholic family next door who's got a whole bunch of kids. I don't know who I base that on. And so it's a very fun story, and it's a little bit poignant too, about how his parents finally realized we need to do better by this little boy.
The Saint in the Cellar.
Yeah, the Saint in the Cellar. Yep, I have my Cooking with Rabbit cookbook, and there is not a cookbook that goes with the 5-book series. I have the 4 Spheres. Now, this is a journal. And it's based on the idea that every day, I don't know if you can see that, you should do something spiritual. I have to something spiritual, something mental, something emotionally satisfying, and something physical. And I kind of separated one of those, so there are actually 5. But that's a very old philosophy. And that, again, touches on the idea that, our spiritual side is vital. We need to be nurturing that every day to really be well-rounded, complete people and healthy people.
Absolutely. Where can people get your books, Laura?
Well, the books themselves, probably best to go to Amazon, but you can find everything about me, everything I do online at www.lauravosika.com. I think you can also get there through bluebellschronicles.com. It goes to the same place. You can find my publisher at gabrielshornpress.com, lots of other great authors, and you can find my podcast at booksandbrews.net. And all of these are on social media, and there are too many to list, but you can find them all through my main website.
And your podcast is Books and Brews.
Books and Brews. We talk to authors. Yep. So I have my Books and Brews mug. We talk to authors, and it started off pairing beers to readings the way you would pair wine to a meal. And so my original co-host was Minnesota's first beer cicerone, which is the beer equivalent of a wine sommelier. And now my husband pairs cocktails. So Michael, life got a little busy and he had to take a break. So my husband is now my co-host, and he pairs cocktails, and we have a lot of fun, and you don't need to drink. We've had, actually, I'd say probably at least a quarter of our guests are teetotalers. They don't drink at all for various reasons. And so sometimes we'll do mocktails, and it's a lot of fun.
Sounds delightful. Sounds wonderful. And this has been delightful. I really want to thank you for
thank you.
This morning, all the way from Tennessee.
Yep. Living here in the hills.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Let's just end with a prayer.
Okay.
We thank you, Lord, for our time together. We thank you for all the things that you brought us together to discuss. And we just ask your continued blessings on Laura and her writing and our podcasts. And just thank you. Amen. It's been delightful. And
thank you very much. It has been.
And get in touch with something else down the line.
All right. I do put out a series of poetry anthologies, and the topic of this one was faith.
Startled by faith?
Yep. And so each year I have, the featured author was J.S. Absher, and each year I have a theme and a featured poet. So
awesome. Yeah. Well, it sounds delightful. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you.